On June 6, 1968, in the early hours of the morning, Ethel Kennedy knelt on the floor of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles beside her dying husband. She was 40 years old, visibly pregnant with her 11th child, and surrounded by chaos she could not control. Photographers captured her face in those moments. The images were published around the world. What is striking about those photographs, looking at them now, is not the grief. Though the grief is there, it is the composure. In the middle of a kitchen corridor, with her husband bleeding on the concrete floor, Ethel Kennedy looked like someone who had already understood what her life was about to require of her. She had spent 17 years inside a marriage that the public understood almost entirely in terms of its most flattering details: the large family, the Catholic devotion, the shared politics, the evident energy. The rougher dimensions of that marriage were known to people close to them and largely left unexamined by everyone else. After Robert Kennedy died, those rougher dimensions became almost impossible to discuss. He was a martyr. She was his widow. The story had its shape, and the shape was not open for revision. What actually happened inside that marriage, what Ethel accepted, what she refused to see, what she endured, and what she may have inflicted, is a more complicated account than the one that has been told. It begins not in Los Angeles, and not with Robert Kennedy, but with the family that made Ethel Skakel into someone capable of surviving the Kennedys in the first place. Ethel Skakel was born in 1928, the sixth of 7 children, into a family whose wealth was substantial and whose reputation for order was largely fictional. Her father, George Skakel, had built Great Lakes Carbon Corporation into one of the more profitable private companies in the United States. He had done it without much formal education and with a personality that people who knew him described variously as magnetic, domineering, and volatile. Her mother, Anne Branach Skakel, was a woman of considerable energy and limited emotional availability. The Skakel household in Greenwich, Connecticut, was large, loud, Catholic, and not particularly supervised. The children were expected to be tough. Sentiment was not especially encouraged. The Skakels were rich in the way that attracts a certain kind of social attention. Enough money to go anywhere, not quite enough polish to be fully accepted everywhere. George Skakel had not gone to the right schools. The family's Catholicism was genuine rather than decorative. They occupied a specific American position, wealthy enough to want proximity to the Eastern establishment just outside the inner circle that the establishment maintained around itself. This is the world that produced Ethel. Not a world of careful manners and managed appearances, but one of physical confidence, competitive energy, and a particular kind of emotional toughness that can look, from the outside, almost exactly like happiness. She was athletic, funny, and relentlessly social. People who knew her as a young woman consistently described her as someone who filled a room, not with glamour exactly, but with forward momentum. She did not brood. She did not, as far as anyone could observe, sit quietly with difficult feelings. When something was hard, she moved faster. She enrolled at Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart in 1946, the same institution attended by Jean Kennedy. It was through Jean that she entered the Kennedy orbit, and through Jean's brother Robert that the orbit became something more specific. Robert Kennedy was 21 when they met, and already operating inside the gravitational pull of his family's ambitions. He was smaller than his brothers, more intense, less naturally charming, and considerably more complicated. Those who admired him described his intensity as moral seriousness. Those who found him difficult described something closer to rigidity, a certainty about his own judgments that left little room for people who saw things differently. Their courtship was relatively brief. They married in June 1950 when Ethel was 22 and Robert was 24. The wedding was held in Greenwich, at the Skakel family estate, and it was large and Catholic and covered by the press in the way that Kennedy events had already begun to attract coverage, as though the family were a subject worth watching even when nothing in particular was happening. What Ethel was marrying into, she understood better than most outsiders would have. She had spent enough time around the Kennedys to know that the family operated as an institution rather than simply as a collection of individuals. Joseph Kennedy Sr. had constructed something more deliberate than a household, a machine for producing power and for protecting the people inside it from consequences that would have stopped ordinary families. The rules inside that machine were different from the rules outside it. Loyalty to the family came before nearly everything else. She had also spent enough time around the Kennedys to understand what Robert's brothers were like with women. This was not hidden information within their social world. The behavior of John Kennedy, in particular, was known, discussed, and largely accommodated by the people around him. It was treated as a feature of powerful men, unfortunate perhaps, but not disqualifying. The women who married into the family made their calculations accordingly. What is harder to determine is exactly what calculation Ethel made. She was not a naive 22-year-old walking into something she didn't understand. She was the product of a rough, competitive, unsentimental household, and she had watched the Kennedy family at close range. She chose this. The question that shadows everything that follows is what she believed she was choosing, and what she decided, early on, she could live without. The marriage began in a period of relative quiet, before the family's political ambitions had fully crystallized into something national. Robert was working, building his career, moving between legal work and his father's projects. Ethel was having children. The first arrived in 1951, and they came with a consistency after that which drew comment even by the standards of large Catholic families. By the end of the decade, she had 7 children and was not finished. The size of the family was partly religious conviction, and it was also something else. People close to Ethel noted that she seemed genuinely energized by children, by the noise and activity they generated, by the sense of being at the center of something large and alive. It was consistent with everything she had grown up with. A quiet house was not a thing she had ever known or appeared to want. But the children also served a structural function inside the marriage that becomes clearer in retrospect. A woman with 7 children, then 8, then 9, then 10, existed in a state of near constant occupation. There was always something that needed doing, always a reason to move, always a demand that arrived before the previous one had been fully resolved. Whether Ethel found this arrangement sustaining or simply preferable to stillness is something she never, in any recorded interview or correspondence, directly addressed. What is documented is that during this period, Robert Kennedy's absences, physical, emotional, and otherwise, were significant. He was away frequently for work. He was devoted to his brothers' careers in ways that consumed large portions of his attention. And he was, by the account of multiple people who were present in their social world during the 1950s, involved with other women. The Skakel in Ethel, the one raised to be tough, to keep moving, to treat sentiment as a weakness, met this information and made a decision. The decision is visible not in what she said, but in what she did. She stayed. She had more children. She became more Kennedy than the Kennedys in her public devotion to the family and its image. Whether that was love or calculation or the only available response to circumstances she had already made irreversible, is not something the historical record settles cleanly. What it does show is that by the time the family's ambitions went national, by the time Jack Kennedy was running for president and Robert was at the center of that campaign, Ethel had already built herself into a particular role. Devoted wife, energetic mother, the one who kept smiling, she was very good at it. The question is what it cost. In the early 1960s, Washington had a particular way of absorbing the Kennedy family. The city was accustomed to powerful people and the performances they required, but the Kennedys brought something different in scale. a combination of political authority, physical glamour, and deliberate image management that the capital had not quite seen assembled in one place before. The press cooperated. The social world cooperated. The family understood, with unusual sophistication for the era, that image was not merely a byproduct of power, but a component of it. Robert and Ethel Kennedy occupied a specific position within this arrangement. Jack and Jackie were the center, the presidency, the elegance, the international attention. Robert was the attorney general, the enforcer, the brother whose intensity did the work that charm could not. Ethel was his counterpart, and the role she played beside him was calibrated with more precision than it appeared. Where Jackie Kennedy was cool, controlled, and visibly private, Ethel was warm, available, and relentlessly energetic. She laughed easily and loudly. She threw people into swimming pools at parties and was photographed doing it. She kept having children. The eighth arrived in 1961, the ninth in 1963, and treated the accumulating size of her family as a source of public delight rather than private strain. She was, in the language of the moment, vivacious. The word appeared in profiles of her with a frequency that eventually made it feel like an assigned description rather than an observed one. The vivacity served a function. It made the marriage legible in a way that required no further examination. A woman that visibly happy, that physically energetic, that surrounded by children and laughter and purpose. Whatever might be said about her husband's private conduct, the surface of the marriage looked like something working. And in the social world the Kennedys inhabited, the surface was largely what people were expected to attend to. Those who attended to more than the surface told a different story. Robert Kennedy's relationship with Marilyn Monroe was the most publicly known of his extramarital involvements, and it remained, for decades, the most disputed. Whether the involvement was brief or sustained, emotionally significant, or purely physical, ended by Robert or by outside pressure, is something biographers have disagreed about without resolution. What is less disputed is that Monroe believed herself to be in a serious relationship with a Kennedy, first Jack, then Robert, and that the manner in which that relationship ended contributed to her psychological deterioration in the months before her death in August 1962. Ethel Kennedy was not a woman who lacked information. She moved within a social world where these things were known and discussed, and she had been navigating that world for more than a decade by the time Monroe died. Whether she knew the specific details of Robert's involvement and what she understood it to mean is not something she ever addressed in any documented way. What she did, in the period immediately following Monroe's death, was what she had always done. She appeared at events, she had another child, she continued to project, with considerable skill, the image of a marriage that was fundamentally intact. This was not unique to Ethel Kennedy. The wives of powerful men in that era operated within a set of expectations that made acknowledgement of infidelity not merely painful, but socially prohibited. To acknowledge it was to break the arrangement that made their own position possible. The marriage, whatever its private reality, was also a public institution, and public institutions had obligations that private feelings were not permitted to override. But Ethel's management of this situation had a quality that went beyond social convention. People who knew her during this period noted that she did not merely endure the arrangement, she appeared, in some observable sense, to enforce it. She was fiercely protective of Robert's image in social settings, quick to redirect conversation that moved toward uncomfortable territory, and consistent in her projection of a marriage defined by shared purpose and mutual devotion. Whether this was love or strategy or self-protection is the kind of question that cannot be answered from the outside. What can be observed is that Ethel Kennedy, by the early 1960s, had become not simply Robert's wife, but the primary curator of what their marriage was understood to be. She was very good at this work. And like all work performed at high sustained intensity, it left marks that were not immediately visible. The parties at Hickory Hill became a fixed feature of Washington's social calendar during this period. They were known for their informality, cabinet members and journalists and athletes and writers thrown together in a setting that felt deliberately less formal than the White House, more alive, more unpredictable. Someone always ended up in the pool. There was always noise, always children underfoot, always the sense of being inside something that mattered. Ethel ran these events with a precision that the apparent chaos was designed to conceal. She knew who was there and why. She understood the social and political uses of hospitality, that a cabinet secretary who had been to Hickory Hill and laughed and eaten well and felt welcomed was a different kind of asset than one who had merely attended an official function. She was doing political work in the register of personal warmth, and she understood the difference between the two even as she made them appear identical. This was a form of intelligence that the people around her sometimes underestimated, partly because it was performed in a domestic key, and partly because Ethel herself rarely made it visible as intelligence. She did not position herself as a strategic thinker. She positioned herself as someone who simply loved her husband, loved her children, loved her friends, and happened to be very good at making everyone feel welcome. The positioning was accurate as far as it went. She did love these things, but it was also simultaneously a performance, and performances require the performer to remain in character even when the character does not fit the moment. By the mid 1960s, Robert Kennedy's political identity was shifting. His time at the Justice Department had changed him in ways that were visible to people who had known him earlier. He was less certain, more troubled, more willing to sit with complexity that the younger version of himself would have resolved through sheer force of will. The civil rights movement had reached him in some genuine way. The war in Vietnam was beginning to produce in him something that looked like moral discomfort. Ethel's political identity did not shift in the same way or at the same pace. She was a hawk on Vietnam considerably longer than Robert was. Her social instincts remained those of someone raised in the competitive, hierarchical world of wealthy American Catholicism, instinctively conservative, resistant to the cultural disruptions gathering around the edges of the decade. She kept her opinions largely to herself in public, but people close to them noted that on certain questions, Robert and Ethel were not in the same place. This was not, by itself, remarkable. Married people disagree. But in a marriage where the public image depended so heavily on the projection of unified purpose, the private disagreements had nowhere to go. They were absorbed, managed, set aside. The performance required it. What accumulates in a marriage where disagreement has nowhere to go, where the surface must always remain intact, where one partner's private conduct is known and not spoken of, is something that doesn't announce itself. It settles into the habits of the relationship, into what each person has learned to expect, and what each has learned not to ask for. By the time the 1968 campaign began, Robert and Ethel Kennedy had been married for 18 years. They had 10 children and one more coming. They had built, between them, something that looked from the outside like an extraordinary life. What it looked like from the inside is a question the historical record approaches only in fragments. A sharp word reported by a guest at Hickory Hill, a moment of distance caught in a photograph, a pattern of behavior among the children that would not become fully legible until years later. The campaign began in March 1968. It would last 85 days. There is a photograph taken sometime in the mid-1960s that appears in several Kennedy biographies without much comment. Robert and Ethel are at a social gathering. The setting is informal, someone's house, people visible in the background. Robert is talking to someone off frame. Ethel is looking at him. The expression on her face is not the wide public smile. It is something more considered, more watchful. It lasts, presumably, only a moment before the smile returns. But the camera caught the interval. No one can say with certainty what that expression means. Photographs are not confessions. But it sits in the record, and it sits oddly beside the version of Ethel Kennedy that was being constructed and distributed at exactly that moment. The version in which everything was warmth and forward motion and 11 children, and Catholic devotion, and a marriage that was one of the more enviable things in American public life. Robert Kennedy's treatment of women operated on two levels that rarely intersected in his public presentation. On one level, he was genuinely affected by women's circumstances in ways that translated into policy commitments. He had a documented concern for the conditions faced by women in poverty, by mothers in the communities he visited during his time in the Senate, by the realities of domestic life that the men around him tended to discuss abstractly, if at all. This was real. People who worked with him on poverty issues in New York and in Appalachia noted that his attention to these questions was not performative. On the other level, his personal conduct toward the women in his immediate social world operated by a different set of standards entirely. The infidelities were the most documented part of this, but they were not the whole of it. People who spent significant time around Robert and Ethel during the 1950s and 1960s described a domestic dynamic that the public record almost entirely omitted. He was demanding in ways that ran well beyond ordinary marital expectation. He expected the household to run perfectly and blamed Ethel when it did not. He expected her to be available, socially, emotionally, practically, at whatever moment he required it, and was visibly impatient when other demands on her attention took precedence. He could be dismissive of her opinions in company, not cruelly, but casually, in the manner of someone who has not considered that the dismissal might register as anything worth examining. Gore Vidal, who moved in overlapping social circles and who had no particular affection for the Kennedys, was among the more pointed observers of this dynamic. His accounts have to be read with awareness of his own antagonisms, but they were not the only ones. Journalists who spent time around the family during the 1960s and who wrote about those years decades later with more candor than they had felt possible at the time, described a household in which Ethel's extraordinary energy was partly self-generated and partly a response to pressure, to the unspoken but consistent expectation that everything would be managed, maintained, and presented without visible effort or complaint. The children came with a regularity that even within their Catholic social world drew occasional comment. By 1967, there were 10. The 11th was conceived during the 1968 campaign. Ethel appeared to embrace each pregnancy as a matter of faith and genuine desire, and there is no reason to doubt that this was partially true. But the rhythm of the pregnancies also mapped onto a marriage in which Ethel's available responses to difficulty were constrained in specific ways. She could not leave. She would not separate. And the role of devoted Catholic mother, performed at scale, was among the most effective possible shields against the kind of scrutiny that might otherwise have found its way into the spaces where the marriage was actually struggling. The question of Robert's fidelity during this period is something the Kennedy family and its authorized biographers handled with varying degrees of candor over the decades. What emerged across multiple independent accounts, from journalists, from people in their social circle, from later biographies that had access to sources unwilling to speak earlier, was not a picture of isolated incidents, but of a sustained pattern. The names attached to that pattern included actresses, socialites, and women who worked in adjacent professional worlds. The pattern was known to their friends. It was known to the press corps that covered the family and was not written about, partly because of the era's conventions and partly because of the specific protections the Kennedy name carried. Ethel's awareness of the pattern is attested to by people close to her, though always in terms that stop short of describing direct confrontation. She was not, by any account, a woman who had been deceived. She was a woman who had chosen, with apparent deliberateness, not to allow what she knew to become something she acknowledged, at least not in any form that could leave a record. This choice, whatever its origins, shaped the texture of their marriage in ways that become clearer when you look at what the marriage required her to produce. She needed to be available to Robert without appearing to make demands on him. She needed to manage a household of extraordinary complexity. 10 children, a constant stream of political guests, a property that functioned as much as a political venue as a family home, without that management ever becoming visible as labor. She needed to maintain the public image of the marriage while privately accommodating its actual terms. And she needed to do all of this while pregnant, frequently, and while projecting an energy and warmth that made everyone around her feel that the whole enterprise was effortless. The effort was not effortless, it was immense. And the people who understood this best were not the journalists or the biographers, but the household staff at Hickory Hill, who watched the operation from close range over many years, and who occasionally, in later accounts, allowed a somewhat different picture to emerge of a woman under considerable sustained pressure, performing at a level that left little room for anything that could not be converted into forward motion. What Robert gave back to this arrangement is a question that produces more ambiguous answers. He was, by multiple accounts, genuinely fond of Ethel, fond in the way that people are fond of someone whose energy and loyalty have become so woven into the fabric of their daily life that the relationship is no longer fully separable from the person. He included her in the campaign. He spoke about her publicly with affection. There were people close to them who believed, with apparent sincerity, that the marriage contained something real beneath the performance, that Robert, for all his complications, understood what Ethel had given him and valued it. But value and reciprocity are not the same thing. What the marriage asked of Ethel was not matched by equivalent demands on Robert. He moved through it with the particular freedom available to men in his social position, free to pursue outside relationships, free to be absent, free to be difficult at home without those difficulties becoming part of the public record, free to be celebrated for his emotional development and his growing moral seriousness, while the person who managed the conditions that made that development possible remained in a supporting role so consistent that it had become nearly invisible. In the spring of 1968, Robert Kennedy announced his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination. The campaign that followed was chaotic, exhilarating, and historically compressed into a period so short that its full shape only becomes visible in retrospect. Ethel was present throughout, visibly pregnant, visibly energetic, photographed constantly. The image of her on the campaign trail became one of the defining images of that spring. A woman at the center of something enormous, carrying another child, smiling with an intensity that the cameras loved. What the cameras did not capture was whatever passed between them in the private hours of that campaign. Whatever was said or not said in the spaces between the events and the crowds and the momentum that was building towards something none of them could yet fully see. On June 4th, 1968, Robert Kennedy won the California primary. He gave a speech in a ballroom at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Ethel was beside him on the stage. He finished speaking, moved through the crowd, and was directed through the kitchen corridor as a faster route to his next destination. She was steps behind him when the shooting began. The 85 days of Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign have been written about with an intensity proportional to how they ended. The books, the documentaries, the oral histories, they tend to organize themselves around the momentum of those weeks, the crowds, the possibility, and then the kitchen corridor, as though the campaign were a story whose meaning was always located at its conclusion. What gets less attention is what the campaign looked like from inside the family it was consuming. Ethel Kennedy entered the 1968 campaign 8 months into her 11th pregnancy. This was not incidental to the campaign's public image, it was part of it. The photographs of her on the trail, visibly pregnant and visibly energetic, became a recurring image in the press coverage of those weeks. She was described in terms that mixed admiration with a kind of amazed observation, as though her physical presence in that condition were itself a form of argument for the Kennedy enterprise. She appeared tireless. The tirelessness was, by that point, the most practiced thing about her. The campaign itself was operating at a pace that exhausted professional political operatives in their prime physical condition. It moved through state after state with a compressed urgency that reflected both the late entry into the race and Robert's specific political style. The belief that direct contact with voters, at scale and at speed, could substitute for the organizational advantages his rivals had built over months he hadn't had. The crowds were real and often enormous. The energy was genuine. People who were on that campaign and who wrote about it later described a quality of forward momentum that felt, in those weeks, like something more than political calculation. Ethel was present for most of it. She traveled with Robert, appeared beside him at events, worked the crowds with an ease that came from nearly 2 decades of practice. She was good at this. Genuinely good, not merely adequate. She connected with people in the way that Robert, for all his intensity, sometimes struggled to. Where he could seem concentrated and demanding, she was open and immediate. Staffers on the campaign noted that she understood its human dimensions in ways that complemented what Robert brought, and that her presence was not decorative. But the campaign was also, during those weeks, taking Robert Kennedy away from his children in a period that would turn out to be the last months of his life. The older children were old enough to understand something of what was happening. The younger ones were not. And the household at Hickory Hill, during the weeks Robert was on the road, was running on Ethel's attention, divided between the campaign and 10 children in various stages of need, with the 11th making its physical demands on her body throughout. What was happening to the children during this period is something the contemporaneous record does not examine carefully. They appear in photographs, at campaign events, at Hickory Hill, in the images that the Kennedy operation understood the value of distributing. They look, in those photographs, like what they were supposed to look like: vigorous, attractive, numerous. The older boys in particular carried the Kennedy physical type with an ease that the cameras found appealing. What the cameras did not find, because no one was looking for it yet, were the early signs of what would become, in the years after Robert's death, a pattern so consistent and so damaging that it could no longer be attributed to coincidence or ordinary misfortune. Joseph Kennedy II, the eldest, was 14 in 1968. Robert Jr. was 13. David was 12. These were boys in early adolescence, being raised inside a household organized around a father whose presence was irregular and whose standards, when present, were formidable, by a mother whose attention was divided among demands that no single person could fully serve. The Hickory Hill environment, the noise, the animals, the constant stream of adult guests, the absence of conventional domestic routine, had been producing something in these children that the public image of joyful abundance did not account for. Therapists and psychologists who have written about the Kennedy children in later years, drawing on what became available in memoirs and interviews decades after the fact, have identified in the Hickory Hill household during the 1960s a specific set of conditions: emotional inconsistency, insufficient structure, the normalization of risk-taking and boundary violation, the absence of quiet and stability, that are associated with particular kinds of developmental difficulty. This is retrospective analysis, applied to a family that did not describe its own experience in those terms. But the pattern it was predicting was already beginning to form in 1968, in children who had grown up with everything and were starting to show what some of that everything had cost them. Robert Kennedy's assassination on June 5, 1968, did not create this pattern. It accelerated and deepened something that had been developing for years, but the acceleration was catastrophic. Ethel Kennedy went into labor with her 11th child 6 weeks after Robert's murder. Roy Kennedy was born in December 1968, and she never met her father. The public response to this fact was one of the more intense expressions of sympathy directed at Ethel during the immediate aftermath of the assassination. The child born into grief, the family continued even in the worst possible circumstances, the Catholic refusal to stop. The image was genuinely moving. It was also the beginning of something that the image could not contain. The Kennedy family's response to Robert's murder was shaped by the template that had been established after Jack Kennedy's assassination 5 years earlier. Grief was to be managed, channeled, and ultimately converted into forward motion. The family did not, as an institution, model extended private mourning. It modeled endurance, the ability to absorb catastrophic loss, and continue producing the public behaviors that maintain the family's position and reputation. Jacqueline Kennedy had set a standard in November 1963 that the family's mythology had enshrined. Now, Ethel was expected to occupy a comparable position. She did not, by any documented account, seek therapy in the aftermath of Robert's death. She did not, publicly or privately, in any recorded way, move through the kind of extended mourning that the loss might have warranted. What she did was keep moving. She threw herself back into activity, into the children, into charitable work, into the social life of Hickory Hill, into the role of Robert Kennedy's widow, which was itself a role with specific requirements and specific audiences. This response was consistent with everything Ethel Skakel had been from the beginning. The Greenwich household that produced her had not prepared her for stillness. The Kennedy family she had married into did not reward it. The Catholic framework that organized her inner life offered suffering as redemption rather than as something to be examined and understood. And the public role she had been assigned, devoted widow, keeper of the flame, mother of 11, had no room in it for the kind of visible disintegration that might have been, for another person in another context, a more honest response to what had happened. The cost of this was not immediately apparent. In the months and early years after Robert's death, Ethel Kennedy appeared, to the people around her and to the press that continued to observe her, to be managing with a fortitude that most people found extraordinary. She was at events, she was raising her children, she was maintaining Hickory Hill, she was present in the ways that mattered publicly, which were the only ways the available metrics could measure. What was happening inside the house and inside the children who were growing up without their father in the care of a mother who had converted her grief into forward motion was not yet visible in any form the public record could capture. It would become visible. It would take time, and it would take a series of events that accumulated over the following decade with a consistency that eventually made denial impossible. But in 1968, in the immediate aftermath, the image held. Ethel Kennedy was the brave widow with 11 children and a legacy to protect. The legacy was Robert's. The protection of it would turn out to be one of the most demanding and consequential projects of her life, and one of the most complicated, because protecting Robert Kennedy's legacy required maintaining a particular story about the marriage that had produced it. A story that was, by then, already considerably more selective than complete. There is a specific kind of person for whom stillness is not rest, but exposure, for whom activity is not avoidance, but the only available language. Ethel Kennedy, in the years following Robert's murder, became the most visible example of this type that American public life had produced in some time, a woman moving at a pace that foreclosed the possibility of arriving anywhere that required her to stop. She was photographed constantly in the years after 1968, at charity events, at Kennedy family gatherings, at Hickory Hill with the children, at political functions where her presence served as a kind of living endorsement of Robert's memory and the causes he had attached himself to. The photographs from this period have a consistent quality. She is always in motion, always surrounded by people, always producing the smile that had become, over 2 decades, so practiced that it was no longer distinguishable from the real thing. Possibly, it had become the real thing. The line between a performance sustained long enough and the self it was originally concealing is not always clear. What she did not do, in any documented or publicly known way, was grieve Robert Kennedy in the manner that his death might have warranted. This is not a moral observation. Grief takes forms that observers cannot always recognize, and the absence of visible mourning is not evidence of the absence of mourning itself. But the specific shape of Ethel's response to Robert's murder, the immediate return to activity, the rejection of therapy, the conversion of loss into public purpose, had consequences that extended well beyond her own interior life. The children watched this. They were, in 1968, ranging in age from infancy to their mid-teens, and they were watching their mother process the violent death of their father by not processing it, by doing, instead, what the family had always done, which was to keep the surface intact and the momentum continuous. The lesson was not stated. It did not need to be. It was demonstrated, daily, by the person whose response to the worst thing that had happened to them set the available template for their own. Robert Kennedy Jr. has written and spoken, in later years, about the aftermath of his father's death with a candor that his mother never approached. He described a household in the years after 1968 that bore limited resemblance to the public image of the family, a place where grief was not discussed, where the older children were left largely to manage their own responses to an event for which no one around them had provided a model, and where the absence of structure that had always characterized Hickory Hill became, without Robert's occasional countervailing presence, something closer to a vacuum. David Kennedy, the fourth child, was 12 years old when his father was shot. He was watching the California primary returns on television when it happened. When the coverage shifted, when it became clear that something had gone wrong. He was alone in the room when he saw it. This detail, which emerged in accounts written years later, has a quality that the family's public image worked hard to make invisible. A 12-year-old boy watching his father die on television alone. David Kennedy would be dead of a drug overdose by the time he was 28. The line between that night in 1968 and a hotel room in Palm Beach in 1984 is not simple or direct. It passes through a decade and a half of accumulating difficulty, through the specific conditions of growing up Kennedy, through choices that were his own and circumstances that were not. But the line exists, and the people who knew David Kennedy in the years between those 2 points described a person who had never, in any observable way, recovered from what he saw that night, and who had never been given, by the family or the household or the culture surrounding both, an adequate way to try. Ethel Kennedy's relationship to David's struggles during the 1970s is something the family's authorized accounts handle with considerable care. She loved him. This is attested to by people who knew them. She was also, by the account of people close to the family, inconsistent in ways that made the love difficult for him to rely on, present and warm in some moments, distracted and unavailable in others, occasionally harsh in ways that the people who witnessed it found difficult to reconcile with the public image of maternal devotion. The harshness, when it appeared, seemed to have a specific quality. Ethel Kennedy had been raised in a household where toughness was the primary emotional currency, where sentiment was treated as weakness, and where the appropriate response to difficulty was to push through it rather than to examine it. She had then married into a family that operated on essentially the same principles at a larger scale. These were the only models she had, and they had served her, after a fashion. They had gotten her through things that would have stopped other people. But they were not adequate models for raising children through grief, and they were particularly inadequate for children who were, by temperament or circumstance, less equipped than their mother to convert pain into forward motion. David was one of those children. He was sensitive in ways the Kennedy template had no category for, and he struggled in ways the template had no patience for. The family's response to his difficulties during the 1970s, the drug use that began in adolescence and worsened steadily, was shaped by the same instincts that shaped everything the family did: manage the surface, protect the reputation, keep the private reality from becoming public in ways that could damage the image. This was not unique to the Kennedys, and it was not unique to that era. Families with reputations to protect routinely handled their members' crises through concealment rather than treatment, and the treatment options available in the 1970s were considerably less developed than what came later. But the specific combination of a family in crisis, a mother whose grief had no outlet, a set of children being raised without adequate structure or emotional support, and a public image that required all of this to remain invisible, produced in the Kennedy household of the 1970s, something that the photographs from that period do not show. What the photographs show is Ethel Kennedy, still moving, still smiling, still producing the image of a woman managing the unmanageable, with a fortitude that the people around her continued to find extraordinary. She was at Hickory Hill. She was at charity events. She was at Kennedy family gatherings, where the mythology of the family was maintained through ritual. The touch football games, the sailing, the competitive energy that had always been the family's most legible public characteristic. She had also, in the years after Robert's death, begun to develop a relationship to his memory that was becoming its own kind of project. The Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Foundation, established shortly after his death, gave the project an institutional form. Ethel was central to it, to the decisions about how Robert was to be remembered, which aspects of his life were to be emphasized, and which were to remain outside the frame. This was not a cynical operation. She believed in Robert's legacy, genuinely and deeply, in ways that were inseparable from her belief in Robert himself. But belief and accuracy are not always the same thing, and the version of Robert Kennedy that the Foundation and Ethel's sustained advocacy were producing was a version with specific omissions. The infidelities were not part of the legacy. The domestic dynamic at Hickory Hill was not part of the legacy. The specific ways in which Robert Kennedy's conduct as a husband and father had shaped the conditions his children were now struggling inside. These were not part of the legacy. The legacy was the public man, the moral evolution, the commitment to the poor, the opposition to the war, the possibility that died in Los Angeles. This was real. It was also incomplete in ways that mattered, because the incomplete version required the people closest to Robert Kennedy to maintain it, and maintenance has costs. For Ethel, the cost was the foreclosure of any private account that differed from the public one. She could not grieve the marriage as it had actually been, because the marriage as it had actually been was not available as a subject. She could only grieve the version that could be shown, the devoted partnership, the shared purpose, the love that the 11 children were offered as evidence of. Whatever else she had felt inside that marriage, the accommodations, the silences, the things she had absorbed and not named, had no place in the available story. And so it stayed where it had always stayed, inside the noise, inside the motion, inside a life that remained 20 years after Robert Kennedy's death, organized around the principle that stillness was not something she could afford. In 1973, Joseph Kennedy II was involved in a Jeep accident on Nantucket that left one passenger, Pam Kelly, paralyzed for life. Joseph was driving. He was 21 years old. The family's response to the accident followed a pattern that was becoming familiar to people who watched the Kennedys closely. Legal management, public minimization, and a relatively rapid return to the forward motion that the family treated as both instinct and obligation. Joseph was not charged criminally. Pam Kelly, who had been a friend, spent the rest of her life in a wheelchair. This was not the first indication that something was developing among the Kennedy children that the family's public image was not equipped to absorb. It was, however, one of the first to produce a permanent consequence for someone outside the family, a consequence visible enough that even the available protections could not make it disappear entirely. The accidents, the legal difficulties, the substance abuse that was beginning to surface among the older children by the early 1970s, these were being processed by a family that had no institutional language for failure. The Kennedys had a language for tragedy, which was different. Tragedy arrived from outside: assassination, accident, the malice or indifference of forces beyond the family's control. Tragedy could be absorbed into the mythology, could be converted into evidence of the family's capacity for endurance. What the mythology had no category for was the kind of difficulty that originated inside the family itself. that suggested something about the conditions under which the children had been raised rather than about the hostility of the world they inhabited. Ethel Kennedy's position in relation to her children's difficulties during the 1970s was constrained in ways that went beyond the personal. She was the widow of a martyred senator. She was the keeper of his legacy. The story that made her position meaningful, that gave the losses of 1968 a shape the family and the public could hold, required her children to be, in some fundamental sense, the continuation of Robert Kennedy's promise. Children who were paralyzed by grief, or who were developing serious addiction problems, or who were making decisions that caused permanent harm to other people, did not fit that story. And a mother who acknowledged that her household had produced these outcomes would have been acknowledging something about the household that the story could not accommodate. This is not to say that Ethel Kennedy's love for her children was contingent on their performance. The people who knew her and who have been willing to speak with some candor about these years describe a woman who was genuinely devoted to her children, who could be fierce in their defense, and who suffered visibly when they suffered. The love was real, but love, in this family, had always operated alongside the requirements of image, alongside the understanding that certain things were managed rather than examined, protected rather than confronted. David Kennedy's trajectory through the 1970s is the most documented of the children's difficulties during this period, partly because it ended in the most visible way, and partly because David himself, in the years before his death, spoke with unusual openness about what his childhood had been and what it had done to him. He described growing up at Hickory Hill as an experience of abundance without stability, of being surrounded by attention that was rarely focused, of existing inside a household where the noise was constant and the actual emotional temperature was difficult to read. He described his father's death as an event from which the family had never recovered and from which he personally had never been given the tools to recover. He also described his mother in terms that were neither condemning nor entirely exculpatory. He loved her. He also found her, in some fundamental way, unavailable to him in the specific way he needed, unable to reach him in the place where he actually was, because reaching him there would have required her to go somewhere she had spent her entire adult life moving away from. The drug use that David had begun in adolescence worsened through his 20s. He was in and out of treatment programs. He was, by multiple accounts, deeply unhappy in ways that the Kennedy framework, the physical competition, the forward motion, the conversion of difficulty into endurance, had no mechanism for addressing. He was also, by those same accounts, profoundly aware of the gap between the family's public image and its private reality, and that awareness was itself a source of pain that the image required him to keep quiet. Ethel sent him to treatment. She visited him. She was, in the accounts of people who witnessed their relationship during these years, genuinely anguished by his condition and genuinely limited in what she knew how to offer him. The limitation was not indifference. It was something more structural, the product of a woman who had been formed by specific conditions, who had survived by specific means, and who was now watching her son require something that those means could not produce. In April 1984, David Kennedy was found dead in a room at the Brazilian Court Hotel in Palm Beach, Florida. He was 28 years old. The cause of death was an accidental drug overdose: cocaine, meperidine, and thioridazine. He had been in Palm Beach because the family was gathered there, and he had been, by accounts from that period, in visible distress in the days before his death. The family was in Palm Beach for the Easter holiday. They were gathered at the compound in the way that Kennedy family gatherings had always operated: collectively, loudly, with the competitive energy and physical activity that had always been the family's most legible expression of itself. David was there and not there. He was present in the way that people are present when they are already somewhere else. Ethel Kennedy was with the family when David died. The accounts of her response in the immediate aftermath describe a woman in genuine shock, which was itself a kind of answer to anyone who had wondered whether she understood what was happening to him. She had understood. She had not been able to stop it. Whether she had done everything that was available to her to do, or whether the things she had not done or could not do had contributed to the outcome, is a question that does not resolve cleanly from the outside. The public response to David Kennedy's death was shaped, as public responses to Kennedy tragedies had always been shaped, by the mythology surrounding the family. The coverage was sympathetic. The framing was familiar. Another Kennedy lost, another chapter in a story of extraordinary achievement shadowed by extraordinary loss. The framing was not wrong exactly, but it was incomplete in a way that the family's position made almost inevitable. What the framing did not examine was the household that had produced David Kennedy and then failed to save him. The specific conditions at Hickory Hill during the years when he was being formed. The specific nature of his mother's grief and its effect on the people living inside it. The specific family culture that treated his kind of pain as something to be managed rather than addressed. These questions were available. They were not asked, not in the immediate aftermath, and not for a considerable time afterward. The other children continued. Joseph went into politics, following a path that produced its own accumulation of difficulties. A first marriage that ended in an annulment that his former wife publicly contested, allegations about the conditions of his congressional staff. Robert Jr.'s substance abuse became public knowledge years after David's death, when he was arrested for heroin possession in 1983, a fact that had been absorbed by the family and managed without public acknowledgement in the intervening period. He recovered eventually and built a public life around environmental advocacy. The recovery was real. So was the period that preceded it. Michael Kennedy, the sixth child, died in a skiing accident in Aspen on New Year's Eve, 1997. He was 39. In the months before his death, he had been at the center of a scandal involving an allegation that he had had a sexual relationship with his family's teenage babysitter, beginning when she was 14. The allegation was not prosecuted. The family's response to it followed the familiar pattern: legal management, public minimization, the closing of ranks. By the time Michael Kennedy died, the accumulation of what had happened among Ethel Kennedy's children had reached a scale that was impossible to attribute to ordinary misfortune. Journalists and commentators who had spent years treating each incident as isolated had begun, by the mid-1990s, to write about the Kennedy children as a pattern, to ask, in print, what the household that produced them had looked like from the inside. Ethel Kennedy did not participate in those conversations. She had never participated in those conversations. She remained, through all of it, the woman she had constructed herself to be after Robert's death: devoted, forward-moving, publicly cheerful, privately opaque. She gave interviews in which she spoke about Robert, about the causes he had cared about the foundation that bore his name. She did not speak about David. She did not speak about the household at Hickory Hill in terms that acknowledged what it had produced. This was not, by any simple measure, dishonesty. It was the most practiced form of the thing Ethel Kennedy had been doing her entire adult life: the management of surface, the conversion of private reality into public image, the maintenance of a story that could be held without breaking. The story required her children to be the continuation of something rather than the consequence of something. Keeping those two framings from colliding was the work of decades. It was work that Ethel Kennedy performed with the same relentless energy she had brought to every other demand the life had made of her. Whether it served her children is a different question. In the years following Robert Kennedy's death, Ethel Kennedy's financial situation was considerably more complicated than the public image of Kennedy wealth suggested. Robert had left an estate, but it was not unlimited, and the specific terms of Kennedy family money, the trusts established by Joseph Kennedy Sr., the conditions attached to them, the degree to which individual family members' access to those funds depended on their relationship with the family's institutional apparatus, meant that Ethel's financial position was bound up with her position inside the family in ways that were not always visible from the outside. Joseph Kennedy Sr. had structured the family's wealth with the deliberateness of someone who understood that money was not merely a resource, but a mechanism of control. The trusts he established were designed to keep the family's assets concentrated rather than dispersed, to prevent the kind of dilution that large families and multiple marriages could produce over generations, and to ensure that the people managing those assets retained meaningful influence over the people depending on them. This was not unusual for wealthy families of that era. What was unusual was the scale at which it operated and the degree to which the Kennedy family's public mythology, the image of a family united by shared values and shared purpose, obscured the more transactional dimensions of how the family actually functioned. Ethel's access to Kennedy money, in the years after Robert's death, was real but not unconditional. She maintained Hickory Hill. She raised 11 children with the material resources that the Kennedy apparatus made available. She traveled, entertained, and continued to operate at a social level consistent with the family's public position. None of this was poverty. None of it was even close to ordinary financial constraint. But it was also not independence. The money that sustained Ethel Kennedy's life after 1968 came from an institution, the Kennedy Family Trust and its various associated structures, that had its own interests, its own image to protect, and its own understanding of what Ethel's public role required her to be. A widow who maintained Robert's legacy, who raised his children visibly and devotedly, who appeared at the right events and said the right things and kept the private complications private, was an asset to that institution. A widow who deviated from that role, who spoke candidly about the marriage, who acknowledged the difficulties her children were experiencing in ways that invited scrutiny of the household that produced them, who pursued any kind of public identity not organized around Robert's memory, would have been something more complicated. This created a structure of incentive that did not need to be stated explicitly to be real. Ethel Kennedy was not, by any account, a woman who was told what to say and what to stay silent about by Kennedy family lawyers or trustees. The arrangement was more subtle than that and more durable. She had internalized the requirements of her position so completely over so many years that the requirements and her own desires had become difficult to separate. She wanted to protect Robert's legacy. She wanted to maintain her position inside the family. She wanted to be the person the public understood her to be. These were genuine desires, not imposed obligations. They were also desires that happened to align perfectly with what the Kennedy institutional apparatus required of her. The Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Foundation became the primary vehicle through which this alignment operated publicly. Ethel was central to the foundation from its establishment, and her involvement gave it a legitimacy and visibility that it could not have had without her. She was Robert Kennedy's widow. Her presence at foundation events, her endorsement of its programs, her willingness to appear in the public record as the living embodiment of Robert's legacy, these were not small contributions. They were the foundation's most valuable asset. In exchange, the foundation and the broader Kennedy institutional apparatus provided Ethel with something that was, for a woman in her position, nearly as valuable as money: a public role with clear requirements and clear rewards. She knew what was expected. She knew how to deliver it, and the delivery produced, reliably, the thing she had been seeking since the night in Los Angeles: a way to make the loss mean something, a way to keep Robert present in the world, a way to convert the worst thing that had happened into something that could be sustained and continued and offered to other people as evidence that the life had mattered. Whether this arrangement served Ethel's interior life is a question the arrangement itself was not designed to answer. It served her public life with considerable efficiency. It gave her days a structure and a purpose that might otherwise have been difficult to locate. It kept her inside a world she understood and had helped to build. And it kept her, reliably, from having to exist in the kind of private silence where different questions might have found her. The Kennedy family's management of its public image during the 1970s and 1980s was an operation of considerable sophistication. It involved relationships with journalists, the careful management of which family members spoke publicly about the deployment of the family's charitable work as a counterweight to the accumulating difficulties among the younger generation, and the maintenance of a set of symbolic touchstones. The graves at Arlington, the eternal flame, the foundation's work, Ethel's sustained and visible devotion that kept the mythology coherent, even as the reality it was supposed to represent grew more complicated. Ethel was not a passive participant in this operation. She understood it. She had been inside it long enough to understand how it worked and what it required. And she was, by temperament and by choice, genuinely committed to its goals, not as a cynical exercise in reputation management, but as a sincere expression of what she believed about Robert, about the family, and about what the losses of 1968 were supposed to have meant. The sincerity made her more effective and also more constrained. A person who is cynically maintaining an image has access, at least privately, to the gap between the image and the reality. A person who has genuinely absorbed the image, who has made it, over decades, into something indistinguishable from her own understanding of her life, has lost access to that gap. She cannot speak from a position outside the story because she no longer has a position outside it. By the 1980s, Ethel Kennedy had been living inside the story for long enough that its outlines had become her own. She spoke about Robert with a consistency and a warmth that did not vary in ways that suggested access to more complicated feelings. She appeared at foundation events and Kennedy family gatherings with an energy that, while somewhat diminished from the extraordinary pace of the 1960s, remained impressive for a woman moving through her 50s. She maintained Hickory Hill, which had become by this point less a family home than a monument, a place that existed in the public imagination as a fixed point in a mythology, visited by journalists and politicians and people who wanted proximity to what the house represented. The house itself was showing its age by this period, and accounts from people who visited Hickory Hill during the 1970s and 1980s describe a property that had accumulated a certain comfortable disorder, rooms that had not been significantly updated since Robert's death, a physical environment that reflected the family's ongoing presence without quite reflecting active care. This was not poverty. It was something closer to a specific kind of stasis, the stasis of a house that had become a symbol before it could become something more ordinary, and that could not now be updated without the update feeling like a revision of something that was supposed to be permanent. Ethel's relationship to Hickory Hill during these decades was itself a version of her relationship to Robert's memory, protective, sustaining, organized around the maintenance of something whose value depended on it remaining recognizable. Change threatened recognition. Recognition was what the whole operation depended on. Outside the foundation and the family gatherings, Ethel Kennedy's social life during the 1970s and 1980s contracted around a circle of long-standing friends and Kennedy loyalists who shared her framework and reinforced it. She was not, by accounts from this period, someone who sought out perspectives that challenged her understanding of her own history. The people around her were people who had known Robert, who shared the mythology, who understood what was expected in terms of what got discussed and what did not. This kind of social arrangement, a circle organized around shared investment in a particular story, is not unusual among people who have experienced public trauma. It provides genuine comfort and genuine community. It also, over time, functions as a form of insulation, keeping the person at its center from encountering the friction that might have produced a different understanding of what had happened and what it had cost. The friction was available if she had wanted it. The record of her marriage, examined without the mythology, contained it. The trajectories of her children contained it. The specific ways in which the family's culture had shaped the people it produced contained it. She did not want it. She had not wanted it in 1968, and she did not want it in 1988. The not wanting was itself a form of fidelity to Robert, to the family, to the version of her own life that made the decades of effort mean something. What it foreclosed, in terms of understanding, in terms of the private reckoning that the life might otherwise have produced, is something the available record cannot fully measure. It can only note the absence. There is a specific fate available to women who survive famous men, and it operates as a kind of slow substitution. The person is gradually replaced by the role. The role has clear requirements: dignity, devotion, the maintenance of the flame, and it offers, in exchange for those requirements, a form of public permanence that the person inside it might not have achieved on her own terms. The exchange is rarely stated explicitly. It happens through accumulation, through the repeated occasions on which the role is what the world wants and the person is what the world is willing to overlook. By the 1990s, Ethel Kennedy had been Robert Kennedy's widow for longer than she had been Robert Kennedy's wife. The marriage had lasted 18 years. The widowhood, by the time the decade began, had already lasted 22. And yet, the public understanding of who Ethel Kennedy was remained almost entirely organized around the marriage, around the moment in Los Angeles, around the 11 children, around the image of the woman on her knees beside her husband on the floor of the Ambassador Hotel. She was in her 60s by this point, and she remained, in the public imagination, almost aggressively fixed at 40. The photographs that accompanied profiles and anniversary retrospectives tended toward the 1960s images. The campaigns, the parties at Hickory Hill, the vigorous woman surrounded by children and purpose. The photographs from the 1990s, in which she appeared as an older woman in a world that had moved considerably past the moment her public identity was frozen in, were used less frequently and with less enthusiasm. The icon required a specific visual register, and the specific visual register belonged to a particular decade. This is not something Ethel Kennedy complained about, publicly or in any recorded way. She had accepted the terms of her public role with the same deliberateness she had brought to every other acceptance the life had required of her. She appeared at the commemorations. She spoke at the foundation events. She was present at the anniversaries, the 5th, the 10th, the 20th, the 25th, at which Robert Kennedy's legacy was rehearsed and renewed for audiences who had not been alive in 1968 and for audiences who had been alive but needed the renewal. What she said at these occasions was consistent. It was also, by the 1990s, so practiced that it had acquired the quality of liturgy. Language whose function was no longer primarily to communicate, but to consecrate. She spoke about Robert's commitment to the poor, his opposition to the war, his belief in the possibility of a more just America. She spoke about the children, about the foundation, about the ongoing relevance of what he had stood for. She did not vary from this in any significant way, across decades of public appearances, in a manner that suggested access to a more complicated or ambivalent account of what the life had actually contained. The consistency was itself a form of discipline. Maintaining it required the active suppression of anything that did not fit, not through conscious dishonesty, but through the long practice of a woman who had learned, early and thoroughly, that the story was more important than the complications the story left out. The complications continued to accumulate outside the story's frame. Michael Kennedy's death on New Year's Eve 1997 came at the end of a year that had subjected the family to a kind of sustained public scrutiny that the available mythological protections were no longer fully adequate to absorb. The allegation about the babysitter had been in the press for months before Michael died on a ski slope in Aspen. The coverage of that allegation had been notable partly for the degree to which it had finally, after decades, begun to examine the Kennedy family's patterns of behavior rather than treating each incident as isolated misfortune. Ethel's public response to both the allegation and Michael's death followed the established template. She was a grieving mother. She was a woman of faith. She had lost another child, and the loss was genuine, and the public expression of that loss was managed with the precision of someone who had been managing public expressions of loss for 30 years. What she said about the allegation and what she said about the conditions that might have produced the behavior the allegation described was nothing. The silence was not new, but it was becoming, by the late 1990s, more audible, more visible as a choice, more difficult to attribute simply to dignity or discretion. The family had produced, across the generation of children raised at Hickory Hill, a record of difficulty so consistent and so damaging that the silence surrounding it had begun to look less like restraint and more like strategy. Journalists who had covered the Kennedy family for decades began, in this period, to write more directly about what the record suggested. Books appeared, some sympathetic, some less so, that attempted to examine the household at Hickory Hill with more candor than had been available while the children were still in their most acute difficulties, and the family's protective apparatus was still at full strength. These books drew on sources within the family's social world who had been unwilling to speak earlier, and they produced a picture of the Hickory Hill household that differed from the public image in ways that were by now familiar, but had rarely been assembled so completely in one place. Ethel Kennedy did not engage with these books publicly. She had never engaged with accounts that complicated the official version, and she did not begin in her 70s. She continued to appear at Foundation events, to be photographed at Kennedy family gatherings, to occupy the role that had been assigned to her and that she had, over decades, made genuinely her own. The role had by this point a kind of cultural permanence that existed somewhat independently of the person inside it. Ethel Kennedy, as public figure, the devoted widow, the tireless mother, the keeper of the flame, was a fixture of American political mythology, in a way that would have been difficult to dislodge, even if she had wanted to dislodge it, which there is no evidence she did. The mythology required her, and she required the mythology, and the mutual dependence had been operating long enough that neither could be cleanly separated from the other. What the mythology did not require, and what it consistently worked against, was any account of the private woman inside the public role, what she had actually experienced inside the marriage, what she had absorbed and not named, what the decades of management and maintenance had cost her in terms of access to her own interior life. These were not questions the mythology had room for. They were not questions Ethel Kennedy appeared to want asked. The closest the public record comes to a glimpse of something less managed is in the accounts of people who knew her during these years, and who describe, occasionally, a woman capable of sharp and unexpected candor in private settings, a quickness of observation, an occasional dryness about her own situation, a flash of something that suggested access to a more complicated understanding of her own life than the public appearances made visible. These accounts are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. They do not add up to a confession or a revelation. They suggest only that the person inside the monument was not identical to the monument, and that she knew it, and that the knowledge was something she had learned to live with rather than something she had resolved. She turned 80 in 2008, and the occasion was marked with the kind of coverage that her public position made inevitable. Profiles, tributes, retrospectives that rehearse the familiar narrative of loss and endurance. She was described, consistently and across multiple outlets, as remarkable. The word was accurate and also insufficient, in the way that words applied to monuments tend to be. Monuments are remarkable by definition. What they conceal is the work that went into the stone. She had outlived Robert by 4 decades. She had outlived 2 of her children. She had outlived the political moment that had defined her public identity, outlived the cultural framework that had made the role of devoted political wife a viable life's organization, outlived, arguably, the public's capacity to hold the Kennedy mythology with the uncomplicated reverence that had once been its primary characteristic. What she had not outlived, as far as the available record suggests, was the story. She was still inside it, still performing, at whatever reduced pace the years required, the role that the story needed her to occupy. Still appearing, still smiling, still producing the image of a woman whose relationship to loss was something the rest of the world could look at and find instructive. Whether she found it instructive herself, whether the decades of public endurance had produced anything that felt, from the inside, like understanding or resolution or peace, is a question the public record does not answer. It offers only the image. The image, by this point, was almost entirely what remained. In the summer of 2012, Ethel Kennedy's granddaughter, Mary Richardson Kennedy, was found dead at the age of 52, hanging in a barn on her property in Bedford, New York. She had been married to Robert Kennedy Jr. for 11 years, had 4 children with him, and had spent the years following their separation in a deteriorating legal and psychological spiral that the people around her had watched with increasing alarm. She had struggled with addiction and depression. She had, in the period before her death, been vocal about the nature of her marriage and what she believed it had done to her. Robert Kennedy Jr.'s conduct during the marriage and its dissolution had been documented in ways that went beyond what the family's protective apparatus could fully manage. His extramarital relationships were known. His treatment of Mary during the divorce proceedings was described by people close to her as systematically undermining, a campaign to establish her instability as the marriage's primary problem, conducted with the legal resources available to a Kennedy and the social support of a family that had always understood how to close ranks. Mary Richardson Kennedy's death arrived in the public record as a tragedy. It was also something else, a consequence, specific and irreversible, of what it had meant to marry into the family that Ethel Kennedy had spent her life constructing and protecting. The pattern that had been visible in the children raised at Hickory Hill had extended now into the next generation, and it had claimed someone from outside the bloodline, someone who had entered the family's orbit and found it, in the end, unsurvivable. Ethel Kennedy was 83 when Mary died. She had been navigating the Kennedy family's relationship with public difficulty for more than 6 decades. Her response to Mary's death, in the available record, is essentially silence. The same silence she had maintained through David's overdose, through Michael's scandal, through the accumulating record of what the family had produced. The silence was not indifference. It was the most consistent thing about her, and it had been consistent for too long to be anything other than the deepest available expression of who she was and what she had decided, somewhere along the way, that survival required. What is striking, looking at the full arc of what the Kennedy children and their children produced across the decades after 1968, is not any single event, but the pattern's persistence. It crossed generations. It crossed the boundary between bloodline and marriage. It reproduced itself in people who had been raised by the children of Hickory Hill and who therefore carried into their own lives the specific inheritance of that household: the emotional unavailability, the normalization of risk, the treatment of difficulty as something to be managed rather than examined, the understanding that image was more important than interior truth. These are not qualities that appeared from nowhere. They were transmitted. And the person most responsible for the environment in which they were transmitted, the person who ran Hickory Hill during the years when the children who would later reproduce these patterns were being formed, was Ethel Kennedy. This is not a simple causal claim. The conditions at Hickory Hill were shaped by Robert Kennedy's conduct, by his absence, by his death, by the specific pressures of the family's public position, by the era's limited understanding of grief and child development, by circumstances that were not within Ethel's control and that no person in her position could have been fully equipped to manage. The causes were multiple, the responsibility distributed across people and circumstances and historical moments that cannot be reduced to a single origin. But the person who was present, who made the decisions, who set the emotional temperature, who determined what was acknowledged and what was managed, who modeled for 11 children the specific approach to pain that the household operated on, was their mother. And the approach she modeled was the only approach she had. It was the approach that had gotten her through Greenwich and through her marriage and through Los Angeles and through everything that followed. It was the approach that the Kennedy family rewarded and the Catholic framework she inhabited sanctified and the public role she occupied required. It was not adequate for what the children needed. The inadequacy produced outcomes that the family spent decades managing and that the management could not prevent. Robert Kennedy Jr.'s 2023 presidential campaign surfaced, in the coverage it generated, a new round of examination of the Kennedy family and its patterns. His public behavior, his relationships with women, his treatment of Mary Richardson Kennedy. These were examined in ways that would have been unthinkable in the coverage of an earlier Kennedy generation. The press had changed. The cultural framework for examining powerful men's private conduct had changed, and the specific protections that had surrounded the Kennedy family for decades had eroded through the accumulation of incidents that had made the mythology increasingly difficult to sustain at its original intensity. Ethel Kennedy was 94 years old during her son's campaign. She was photographed at a small number of family events. She remained at Hickory Hill, which had by this point become genuinely monumental. A house whose relationship to its own history was so freighted that ordinary domestic life inside it had become almost inconceivable. She had been in that house for more than 60 years. She had raised 11 children in it. She had watched it become, gradually and then completely, a symbol of something larger than the family it had housed. Of a political moment, a lost possibility, a mythology that American culture had proved willing to maintain long past the point where the evidence supported it. The house had required maintenance across those decades. Physical maintenance of the kind that aging properties require, and the kind that Ethel had been providing since 1968. The daily and annual and decennial labor of keeping the story coherent, keeping the image intact, keeping Robert Kennedy's legacy in a form that could be offered to the world as something finished and meaningful rather than something partial and complicated. The second kind of maintenance had been the work of her life after 40. It had given the decades a shape and a purpose. It had also, by the nature of what it required, foreclosed a different kind of examination, the kind that might have produced a different understanding of the marriage, a different account of the household, a different relationship to what the children had experienced and what they had carried into their own lives. The foreclosure had consequences that extended across generations, and that eventually reached people who had never met Robert Kennedy and who had no stake in his mythology. Mary Richardson Kennedy had no stake in it. She had entered it through marriage and had found it, as an organizing system for a life, inadequate in ways that the family's public face had given her no way to anticipate. What Ethel Kennedy understood about the damage the family had done, and what she permitted herself to understand, and what she was constitutionally capable of understanding, given everything she had been and everything she had survived? These are questions that sit at the edge of what the available record can answer. She had been, by any measure, an extraordinary person. The endurance was real. The loyalty was real. The energy that had sustained 11 children and a political legacy and a house full of history across more than half a century was not performed. Or rather, it had been performed so long and so completely that the performance had become the person, and the person was genuinely formidable. But formidable is not the same as adequate, and the record of what the family produced across the decades after Robert Kennedy's death, the overdoses, the accidents, the scandals, the death of a woman who had married into it, believing in something that turned out not to be what it appeared, is a record that the mythology cannot fully absorb, no matter how long the mythology has been running, and no matter how sincerely the person at its center has believed in it. The belief was sincere. The sincerity does not settle the question of the cost. It only makes the question harder to ask. Ethel Kennedy died in August 2024 at the age of 96 at Hickory Hill. She had lived in that house for more than 6 decades. She had outlived her husband by 56 years, outlived 2 of her children, and outlived the political era that had produced her public identity by so long that the era itself had passed into something closer to mythology than memory. The obituaries were generous. They rehearsed the familiar narrative: the large family, the Catholic faith, the extraordinary endurance, the decades of devotion to Robert's legacy, and the causes it had organized itself around. They used words like remarkable and indomitable. They described a woman who had absorbed more loss than most people encounter across several lifetimes and had continued, regardless, to move forward. The description was accurate. It was also in the way of obituaries for people whose public role has become more substantial than their private reality, incomplete in ways that the occasion did not invite examination of. What the obituaries did not examine, what they were not designed to examine, was the specific nature of what Ethel Kennedy had agreed to, and what that agreement had cost the people around her across the decades she spent honoring it. She had agreed, sometime in the years after Robert's death, to be a particular kind of person in a particular kind of story. The person was devoted, enduring, faithful. The story was one of loss transformed into legacy, of a marriage whose difficulty was subsumed into its public meaning, of a family whose private fractures were less important than what the family was understood to represent. She had agreed to maintain this story, not through a single decision made at a specific moment, but through the accumulated choices of decades, each one individually defensible and collectively producing something that functioned as a life's organizing principle. The principle held. The story survived her. Robert Kennedy's legacy remains, in American political memory, relatively intact. The martyred senator, the moral evolution, the possibility that died in Los Angeles. The foundation continues its work. The photographs from the 1960s remain in circulation. The mythology, somewhat worn at its edges but fundamentally coherent, continues to be available to people who want it. What does not survive as cleanly is the fuller account: the marriage as it actually operated, the household as the children actually experienced it, the specific ways in which the story's maintenance required the suppression of evidence that would have complicated it. David Kennedy is buried in Brookline, Massachusetts, near his father. He was 28 when he died, 12 years old when he watched his father killed on television, alone in a room at Hickory Hill. The distance between those two facts contains something that the mythology has never fully accounted for, and that Ethel Kennedy's sustained and sincere devotion to the story made it structurally impossible to account for. Mary Richardson Kennedy is buried in Bridgehampton, New York. She entered the family's orbit believing something about it that turned out not to be true, and the distance between what she believed and what she found produced consequences that no amount of institutional management could reverse. These are the places where the story's edges become visible, where the gap between what was maintained and what was real left marks that outlasted the maintenance. Ethel Kennedy was not a villain. She was not a victim. She was a woman formed by specific conditions, operating within specific constraints, making the choices available to her with the tools she had been given. The tools were real, and they were formidable, and they were, in the end, not sufficient for everything the life required. What remains is a house in McLean, Virginia, and a foundation bearing a dead man's name, and a story that a woman spent 56 years keeping intact. The story is not false. It is not complete. The difference between those two things is where Ethel Kennedy actually lived, in the space between the version that could be shown and the version that could not, maintaining the boundary between them with a discipline so total that it became, over time, indistinguishable from the truth. She was very good at it. Whether it was enough is a question she never, in any recorded way, allowed herself to ask.